I need to begin by having an uncomfortable conversation and by making myself slightly vulnerable, because I had an introduction to that video and I didn't read it to you. So I'm a bit embarrassed and I apologise, but I'm going to do so now because it's relevant at a couple of levels. So that was my uncomfortable conversation, but there's more to come. That incredibly eloquent man is a gentleman called Abid Hussain, who is the Director of Diversity at the Arts Council England. He was recommended to us by Diana Ragsdale, who was the keynote speaker from last year's Kōrero in Christchurch. We were, Creative New Zealand that is, incredibly impressed by Art Council England's initiative, The Creative Case for Diversity. So we asked him to produce a video that explores equality and inclusion in the arts from a policy perspective and what diversity in the arts means to him personally. And I think you'll all agree he did that incredibly eloquently. He's drawn on his own experiences over the past 3 years in leading this initiative and challenges us to think afresh and turn aspiration into action. Abid is also on Twitter right at the moment. And if you want to ask him questions, his Twitter handle is @ArtyAbid. If you're wondering why he's still up at 3 a.m, he's currently observing Ramadan. Can I ask a personal favour? Please don't Twitter and tell him I forgot the introduction. I would really appreciate that. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to, somewhat badly, begin the process of this conversation. And I'd like to do so by introducing our panel to begin with. On my extreme left is Kim Tuaine. Kim is of Cook Island descent and currently the CEO of the Pacific Business Trust. She has an extensive legal background and has founded 2 very successful firms in Sydney, and has developed a reputation as a strong supporter of startups, harnessing diversity and developing innovative business models. She's passionate about economic and social equity and celebrating the strengths and the success of the Pacific communities. In the centre, we have Karl, and you met Karl earlier, of course, as a keynote speaker. He operates his own consultancy, as you heard earlier, Haumi, and lives in Gisborne. He specialises in cultural strategy, concept and content development. And it's my very great pleasure to have him as part of our Creative New Zealand Arts Council. And at my immediate left is Annette Shun Wah, who some of you also met in one of the breakout sessions earlier. Annette is a Sydney-based producer, writer, actor and broadcaster with significant experience in the arts in Australia. She is an executive producer at multidisciplinary intercultural theatre company Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. And that organisation is dedicated to opening up pathways for emerging writers, directors and producers of Asian heritage and building a resilient Asian Australian performance community. Can I ask you please all to welcome them? Now that you have no faith whatsoever in how I'm going to manage this afternoon's panel conversation, I wanted, unsurprisingly, to begin by talking about leadership. Clearly, one of the points that was being made in that video was that actually having leaders who were clearly representing diversity at the tables where decisions were made was important. Is that something that has resonated in your experience, Annette?
Yeah, absolutely important. I think that leadership and role models I like to talk about together because just by being there, you create a possibility for people who might have aspirations to follow your path. And without role models, we've found, for example, in Australia, we discovered recently that there were very, very few people applying to be directors, theatre directors, and applying for the courses that were available. And when we drilled a bit deeper, it was because they hadn't seen anyone else doing that job. There's a very small number of Asian directors in Australia, but these people didn't know them and then thought, why should I devote 3 years of my life to go down that path, do a course to come out and have no hope of actually ever using that qualification. So seeing someone there who is actually doing the job is a great inspiration. But also having someone in that leadership role who can think about what's required and feed into the discussion about how to make those conditions available, create the pathways or whatever it is that makes it possible for people to find their way through the ecosystem is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Karl, what do you think, what do we mean by leadership in this particular instance? How does that manifest itself?
I think there's a few things. First, to build on leaders and role models, I'd probably focus additionally and alongside on leaders and influencers, because I think one of the big leadership issues is the fact that sometimes we're too simplistic in the forms of leadership we're looking for. So we focus, for example, on I'm trying not to pick a category because then it gets political, but we focus sometimes on, say, for example, ethnic background, where maybe the conversation should be on capability. And it's a different thing. It's about the best person for the job. And actually, in my experience, some of the best leadership in, say, in the Māori world is when you have the right Māori capability alongside other technical capability. Now, that could be accounting, or that could be administrative, or that could be a number of other things. But I think it's a conversation for me about capability and acknowledging the fact that I think in terms of that leadership conversation, we're all getting to that same page of understanding that we want dynamic and diverse leadership, but actually, even at a governance level, needing to build that capability takes time. And I think we need to have really clear and concise transitional strategies in that process as well. And then the other thing I'd say about leadership is that it just doesn't happen around the boardroom tables or in the offices of CEOs and other things. Leaderships are the artists themselves, and influencers are the artists themselves, and actually being able to understand the space that they operated within and actually be activists, I guess, within that space to create change through their own sense of direction and passion.
So within that exists the notion that leadership lives at a variety of levels. Kim, in the work that you're doing, particularly in Pacifica business, are you finding that the leaders in your area are being engaged in a broader sense than just the businesses that you're running? Are they being asked to be a part of a broader conversation?
No, and I think that's part of the problem, particularly amongst Pacifica, is that politically we've been grouped together as a homogeneous group, but our leadership is reflective of fairly traditional ideas about leadership and cultural traditions, which alienates a lot of people from that conversation and to want to be included in leadership. And I think that we forget in Pacifica too that our cultures in a diaspora setting are very different. They shift and they change and they act differently. And I think the challenge for us is to bring in younger generations of people that have grown up in New Zealand and have a very different experience of their own culture and their sense of belonging and identity, and make a space for them to be able to blossom.
So is the argument that actually if you embrace the notion that there needs to be broader and more diverse voices in leadership, that actually leadership itself will change, that it isn't going to be exactly the same thing as that which has come in the generations ahead? Annette, does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I think that it's part of the whole thing about the diversity discussion, is that you're bringing new experiences and perspectives and experiences to the table so that things don't have to be done the same way all the time. Here's a new way of doing it. Here's a new route to take to getting there, and a new route to go outwards from it. So I think that's absolutely...
Certainly as a leader, that's a really uncomfortable place to be. The notion that the thing that I was raised to do, the way in which I was trained to do it, may have almost no relevance at some point in the future. Some days, really good idea. Love somebody else to take responsibility. But in many ways, that's a very uncomfortable place to exist in. I really liked the point which was made a couple of times in that video around don't overcomplicate it. Don't make it so mysteriously extraordinary that somehow you never get anything done because there's no, you never land on the perfect definition. Karl, where does that balance between kind of beachhead doing stuff exist alongside actually acknowledging that you do want frameworks and other things, processes, etc., to sit behind it?
Yeah, there is a balancing act. I mean, I'm a fundamental believer in just making it happen. I think
you made that point this morning a couple of times.
Thank you. But I do think you'd be silly not to contingency plan along the way. You know, we don't want to be completely reckless. It reminds me of a project we did where we did a voyage to Easter Island, to Rapa Nui, and we had the benefit of one of our very revered waka leaders, Heku Nukumai Busby, who had significant experience in the whole navigation realm. And our leaders were on each of the waka who had significant experience in reading the environment. But the fact of the matter was, when we left Auckland to travel to Easter Island on 2 double-hulled sailing canoes, we didn't have the system and knowledge proofed because it hadn't been done in 600 years. So we knew once those, I wasn't on the waka, I flew over there, but we knew once those waka left, we really trusted in the wider environment, in the waihingaru, and I guess the ability of those individuals to connect with nature and to trust in nature. And it was largely a dream voyage to rekindle that piece of knowledge. But if we hadn't taken that risk, measured risk, we wouldn't have got there. And then in the other side of the world, sorry, I'm going on, I was just telling someone in a break, one of the biggest issues with my board at the time that I was working to was that we couldn't get the waka insured, and because nobody wanted to touch them, even though they're unsinkable, nobody wanted to touch them. These are whole tōtara, or kauri rather, waka, and so it wasn't until the waka were disappearing across the horizon, one of the board members said to me, "How did we go with that insurance?" And I told them we didn't. Yeah. So, but in saying that, I did have them sign indemnity agreements. So it was always about contingency planning.
Yeah. Kim, do you accept that concept of not overcomplicating? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think you have to just run with it and try stuff. And the other thing I really loved about that video was how he was sort of saying that, failure is actually a really good tutor in a lot of things that you do. Because, in terms of my funders, I'm always explaining data that works and this is successful, but no one ever wants to hear about what fails. And there's an interesting story to be told in relation to failure as well. So running with it is being aware of the failure, recording it, noting it, learning from it, and then, celebrating the success as well.
It's quite a complicated thing, particularly for government agencies, to manage the notion of failure, because actually there's a whole lot of responsibility that sits behind government agencies and public funding that makes it very difficult to imagine failure, and yet absolutely lots of fantastic things have come out of that. And are there any things that you can think of in your experience which are symbols of either the failure or of the ways in which that just getting on with it has worked and been useful to advancing the proposition?
Yeah, I was very interested in that point you just made, is that the government funders in particular, but many funding organisations talk, at least, in the arts, they talk a lot about celebrating work that's truly innovative and risk-taking and experimental and all this sort of really exciting language, all this sort of stuff we should be making, take the risks and get out there. And yet, when it comes to giving you the money and making you acquit it, you do have to, tick all the KPIs, and you have to reassure them at every step of the way. And it's the sort of the processes you go to in order to acquire the funds to make this exciting experimental risk-taking work is the exact opposite. So there's a bit of an inconsistency there that I think that needs to be looked at. In terms of our operations, my background is actually not in theatre, which is where I work now, but in the media. And so I came up with a career of writing and presenting on television and radio, basically. And I was just on the board of the theatre company. And when I decided to take over the company because there was nobody else to do it, I had no experience. So I didn't really know what I was doing, and I still largely don't know what I'm doing. But I know what has to be done. I know where I need to get to. And so I chart this really weird, inefficient course, but we get there, and on the way I break a lot of rules and I do a lot of things that other people would know are not possible, but we've made them possible. So it is a case of just do it.
And certainly within the context of the conversation around diversity, you do have to find that mechanism for simply saying, actually, we just have to move forward with this. You can't, there's never going to be a perfect time when everything works in exactly the framework that you want it to. You do have to recognise that this is an important thing to do and move forward with it. That sounded like a speech, but it really was kind of a question, that there is no other way.
I think one of the most limiting things in strategy and policy and just project development generally, it was something I brought up earlier, is linear process. Because linear process has an endpoint, circular process doesn't. You just keep going and going and going. And I really think that to actually fundamentally accept the concept of failure is a failure in itself, and that you actually have to look at iterative processes and actually create measures that actually don't even acknowledge that concept, because I don't think it's necessary. I certainly don't look at anything that I do in terms of the people that I work with and have a failure clause in there. It's just not something that's in the consciousness of the stuff that we do. I mean, there's things that don't go that well, but that's a learning opportunity.
Yeah, and I guess in our context there can be different ways in which you measure success, and all of us wanting to measure that success very largely on the basis of the quality of the art, in which case there is unlikely to be failure in that context. On a couple of occasions, he brought up the kind of the dichotomy of sort of uncomfortable conversations and unconscious bias, and that he sort of linked them, that we all bring unconscious bias to things, and that we've got to have uncomfortable conversations, sometimes to identify where those bias are, and other times in order to find out what we do and don't know. Where do you think, as a society, we sit, and you're all going to bring your own experiences, obviously yours is Australian, where, Annette, do you think we sit in having those uncomfortable conversations? Are we getting better at it? Is it part of the dialogue?
In Australia, sadly, I don't think we are. Quite the opposite lately. In that we went through this period probably 20 years ago when things were seeming to improve, and where people were more open and more embracing of difference. But in recent times, it's gone the other way, and it's not to say, let's call it racism, has not gone away. Perhaps it was just undercover for a little while, and now it's more covert. In some way, I have to say things have not been improving. But that's a challenge to us to, at least you know who the enemy is now. You know what you're dealing with now. And that's a challenge to us to think about it and think about how to engage with people's different biases or whatever. Having a bias is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a part of what makes each of us individual. It's about the impact that has in the way in which you relate to one another and in the way in which you relate to what you do, that it can still have a positive outcome.
Kim, same question. Where do you think we're up to in having uncomfortable conversations?
Well, I can kind of speak to the Australian experience as well, since I've lived there for most of my life, and I would say it's a big part of the reason why we've left over the 10 months ago, was because there is no space for those conversations. There is no recognition for anything that's not mainstream and predominantly white and male in Australia any longer, and it's very sad. I think the wonderful thing about New Zealand is that there's recognition of it. I was really surprised in my first week in New Zealand. I was at an event with Treasury, and we had people in Treasury talking about how they had to be careful about utilising unconscious bias in their decision making, which struck me as extraordinary because it was something that is never discussed in Australia, not for at least 2 decades anyway. So I think New Zealand is moving in a positive direction as I guess an outsider's perspective, somewhat of an outsider. I think within the Pacific space it's a little difficult because so I'm going to try and not be political now too, which is quite difficult. I think a lot of mainstream's issue, or the Pacifica as a group's issue with mainstream, is we just want to be visible. We just want to be seen in a commercial way, in an artistic way. We want it to reflect the diversity of everyone within our communities, and there's a lot of difference. And so when mainstream, or our community's perception of mainstream's view of us, is all based on unconscious bias. It's based around things like, and I deal with this in the procurement space and the government space a lot, there's a real informality to Pacifica people. Well, they're running late because they're Pacific. There's this sort of thinking, and it's pervasive. But I think it's hopeful that people are willing to talk about it.
A nice term like unconscious bias kind of makes us feel a little bit better about all these things. In some instances I think it's an appropriate terminology. In other terms it's really probably as simple as hereditary prejudice. And I think it's just about kind of finding the balance between the way we want to talk about these things. I think there's a groundswell of change in New Zealand. And look, people often think, within Māori there's less unconscious bias. It's shocking. It's shocking. It's just as bad. And the one thing we have going in our benefit is, we sad as it is, and in those contexts, exactly, there's no guessing where people are sitting. You're told front and square and centre, and fairly, slightly bruised afterwards, but then you have a cup of tea and everything's good. I think that's really healthy, because you don't sort of guess what they were thinking. And the kind of unconscious part just isn't there. It's very conscious. So I think there's something to learn about that. But I think it's a really complex conversation, because you actually, again, I think have to have a very clear understanding within yourself about how you articulate the world in which you live and how you identify. And I think it comes back to that really basic premise of humanity again.
Kind of taking a sort of side position on that question of uncomfortable conversations, and imagining, but not imagining, believing that generally in this room and on this, DS are leaders of one sort or another. How good is leadership at inviting uncomfortable conversation, putting unconscious bias to one side for a moment, but actually, so for me, I guess the breakthrough is when you don't just, for somebody like me, squirm uncomfortably in an uncomfortable conversation, but that you actually invite it. That seems to me to be a breakthrough. Does that happen?
I think more and more so. I think it's kind of coming to terms with being a heretic, and I think if you can find the enjoyment in it as well, it helps, because there is something really fun about being disruptive, and watching people, and the squirming is actually quite enjoyable along the way as well. But I think it's about kind of understanding, flippancy aside, that the need to disrupt is actually an active part of change. And I think the more that you can disrupt and create that change and do it in a way that preserves the integrity or the mana of the people that you're dealing with, I think that's a really important part of it, the better the outcome.
Well, I think that one of the great things about uncomfortable conversations is it brings together two clashing ideas, and out of that you get some amazing synergies and something new that can flower, and that's phenomenal. And I see that happening all the time in the work that I'm doing, particularly as we're engaging now with Pacifica all along the spectrum, from traditional, conservative, faith-based communities right through to the other end of the spectrum, queer, out, proud, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, I love that it's forcing us to take a long, hard look at ourselves, be more inclusive as a community of the diversity that's there. And I'm kind of sitting back and waiting to see what's going to happen next.
I think in a leadership role, you're at the forefront, and you're more likely to encounter those uncomfortable conversations, both because you're trying to break new ground, but also from the other end, the people who you are trying to lead will question you in terms of what you're doing and what you're doing for them and what you're actually achieving, and those are equally uncomfortable, and they're the things that impel you to keep going. But I just flashed in my mind this recent conversation I had. I went to see a small professional play by a group in the northern suburbs of Sydney, which is very white, middle class, well-to-do, and they have a very active amateur theatre company, and I helped them cast a Vietnamese actor for a role in one of their plays, and I felt like we'd broken new ground by doing that, and it was a young actor who really needed that experience of working in a conventional environment like that. And then they told me they're doing Calendar Girls, and that they'd cast it, this British play, Calendar Girls, and they'd cast it and they're just looking for the male lead and they were having trouble. And I said, great, maybe I know someone, for that role. And they said, oh, he has to be English. He has to be very English. And I said, but why? Well, because he's English and he's suffering leukemia and he's got this pivotal role. And I said, yeah, but there's a lot of South Asian people who live in England. Why couldn't he be, South Asian English? Wouldn't that be possible? Why don't you cast an Asian Australian actor? And the look on the face of the people was entirely shocked. And I thought, well, I've made my point. But to give her credit, the director then rang me up the next day and said, you're right, I've thought about it. He could be possibly South Asian. Find me someone. I failed. I couldn't find anyone.
Oh, never mind.
That wanted to do it.
That was going to be my question. I guess that the points you just made illustrate all of that. They illustrate the fact that leaders have a responsibility in that unconscious, in that uncomfortable conversation place, and that sometimes just inviting that conversation is it raises the awareness beyond even whether you were able to find a South Asian actor who particularly wanted to front with a number of fundraising people in the nude.
But hopefully next time that director casts a show, she will think a bit more broadly about it.
Exactly.
I also think that when you pose difficult questions or have uncomfortable conversations, you have to be prepared to receive the answer, and that's a skill, actually, to sit there and listen and take it when you put it out there.
Do you think that we are adequately preparing leaders for how you might participate in that and how you might actually engage with the question of diversity? I mean, part of the earlier point, so sorry, I didn't even give you a second before I'm answering my own question, but part of the thing that you raised before was that in fact the role models, the leaders that sit in those positions will be the opportunity for change that will come along in their wake. But until we get there, are we actually preparing leaders adequately to have those sorts of conversations?
It's a really interesting question, because as you were talking about it initially about leadership, I'm thinking, and you were talking about finding leaders who also had other skills, and then I thought, is leadership a skill? Is leadership a skill that can be learnt, or are leaders born? And I've been looking for someone to work with me. I finally have a little money to hire staff, so it's not just me anymore. And I'm trying to look for someone who can take over from me, basically. And that person needs to have the leadership skills or some leadership strength, because that's been my greatest strength, actually. I don't know what I'm doing and all the other things, but I have known how to lead the charge forward, and that's what this person needs. And I've been thinking, well, maybe they don't know how to put a budget together, but you can learn that. You can learn the accounting, you can learn the technical sort of jargon that you need to learn. You can learn how to piece that together, but can you learn to be a good leader, or is a leader born? And that's a question. That's my answer to your question, is another question.
Yeah.
I can answer from a personal perspective, I suppose. I have the joy, actually, of mentoring a few young people, and they have incredible potential, and they contribute really significantly to different things that I involve them in. They also are millennials, and with that come a whole range of other issues, and sort of respectfully beating that out of them in order to actually engage them in the right way and to give them challenges that are confronting to them, and then to hold their hand and walk through them takes time. And as much as I'm invested in supporting these people, the reality is it takes a lot of time to do this, and it's trying to find that balance between investing time in them, ensuring that projects and outcomes continue to be delivered along the way. But I'm particularly from the ones that I'm working with, they're outcomes of Māori education sector, so kohanga and right through. And, you know, they've gone on, one of them in particular has gone on to study at Stanford and then come back to New Zealand. He's an incredible mind, but I know what my challenge is with him. And I think if everybody had one or two people that they worked with, I think we'd get there. But I think it is a real issue because of the draw on time at the moment for, sector-wide, I mean.
One of the programs that they run in the UK is the idea that you find a mechanism for potential leaders to enter organisations so that they can get a broader experience and understand what it's like to be in those sorts of circumstances, which is kind of, you're talking about it at a personal mentoring program kind of point of view, but actually that notion is also valid, isn't it? That there's got to be the opportunities in order for people to grow, regardless of whether they're born or trained. I guess I believe that it's a bit of both, but that's you must be involved a lot in that sort of mentoring process.
Sort of. what we're really trying, I mean, in terms of businesses, we're trying to move away from mentoring and to giving people frameworks so that they drive their own insights, so that they direct themselves. I think within Pacifica, the problem is that there isn't a diversity of opportunity. So opportunity is limited to a few sectors only. And then leadership is jealously guarded by very few, who are seen as having all of the respect, the authority, the cultural status. So that's a big problem. And there's a very distinct hierarchy, I think, that needs to be engaged with young people, and for them to have permission to do that, because a lot of them feel like they're not entitled to be part of that conversation with their own leadership. So it's a really difficult one. And it's a challenge that we encounter all the time, and I don't know the answer to that, actually, to be honest.
In a minute or two, I'm just going to open it up to questions on the floor, but I wanted to ask you all one more question before we do that, and it's really about audience engagement. It's really about saying, and you know, you've all had experiences, or you two in particular have had experiences around that specific audience engagement piece, but chicken and egg, which comes first? Do you put it out there and the audience engages, or do you have to find the audience and then they'll engage? Or is it not that simple?
I think there's different ways to skin a cat.
Could we get? We got a
how many more
poultry
analogies?
analogy.
How many more analogies can we get? I think I spoke a little bit in the breakout session about there's one way you can do it, which is when you create a project to have people involved, the community involved right from the beginning with the research as you develop all the different stages. So by the time you get towards the end of the project, you already have a whole bunch of people who know about it, who are familiar with it, who are excited by it, who have some sense of ownership in that project. And therefore, you've already got an instant audience. They're already there. The other thing I would say, though, because we make our work for main stage audiences or for main stage venues, is that to engage an audience, you need to make something that they're interested in or that resonates with them. And I think that for a lot of people who don't go to the theatre, which is where I don't go to the theatre a lot, is because they don't see anything advertised that speaks to them, that has anything to do or is relevant to them and doesn't look like them or anyone they know or anything that has anything to do with their lives. And so I think that by putting material up there, stories, people, ideas that actually speak directly to people in their lives, lived experiences, you will engage an audience just by doing that.
Okay. Kim, do you have anything particular?
Oh, well, I was just thinking about business, really, but it's kind of different, I guess, from a commercial sense. My gut says you just try it, and if you're passionate about it, you know, and you do a few technical things and you test it and it works, then that's great. And people will tell you if it's crap, like they'll let you know quite vocally. So, yeah.
I'd argue that business is a performance in one way or another anyway.
Well, yeah. But I mean, it's underpinned by passion.
Yeah.
Inevitably.
Has to be.
And people connect with that in business, I think. I mean, obviously you need to have the appropriate model and structures in place. That's a given. But yeah, in business, if you're really passionate and committed to something and you've got a great idea and you've done all of the work, I mean, people will engage with it. So I'm less concerned about that question, I guess.
That's fine.
Yeah.
In terms of the various things I'm engaged with, there's a whole lot of different approaches. It goes from what I would almost characterise as the ridiculous end in one of our national institutions, where the degree of analysis around visitor and market profiles is so incredibly scientific that it almost turns a person into a widget on paper, you know, from the demographic profile to the psychographic variables, you know, so people start getting termed as treasure hunters or intellectual challenges, and and then it breaks it down again by market, and there's that end of it. Kind of cool in the sense that at the end of it you can test that market research and that kind of visitor profile and see how you went, which is great. And at the other end, the end I prefer, which is to work on a hunch. And the hunch, I think, is a really important thing because, I think we undervalue intuition and undervalue and I'm part of me always sort of says about market research, yeah, but visitors don't know what they don't know. And that's probably a little bit arrogant, but I kind of believe it, and apologies if it is, but I kind of think there's limitations in what can be presented, and the surprise and the thing that wasn't expected surely can be that thing that gives the X factor. So I think however you work, understanding where your focus is fundamental. Fortunately or unfortunately, most of the things that I do work from the community being the stakeholders, being the market from the beginning. That's good and bad too, because again, there are definite levels of expertise that sit within the community, and then there's ways that you actually have to navigate things that, for example, would just never work, but they ultimately, in exhibition terms, are your audience at the end of the day.
We have some roving microphones. In terms of your engagement, you're welcome to ask questions of anybody on the panel. Also, you're welcome to give a response to the video if you haven't already tweeted it to Abed himself. But feel free, really, this is your opportunity to engage with this conversation.
Hello, everybody. It's a very interesting conversation. And I noticed one contradiction in itself which might occur only to me. But my question and contradiction is that we're talking about new ways of engagement, new experiences, and at the same time you guys are sharing experiences that we are not open to have those uncomfortable questions and conversations. So my question is there a way to accept new ways provided that mindset, and how radical and extreme those new ways of engagement can be? It's a question for everybody.
Sorry, did I give the impression that I wasn't open to the unconscious?
No. Is that we were talking about, in terms of Australian market, New Zealand market, how open communities, organizations are to have those uncomfortable conversations, and as a result of what your insights were, that it's not, New Zealand seems to be more open to have those conversations and talk about diversity and different topics, but on the general level, we are not that open to have those conversations. That's what my impression was of what you shared, that Australians don't have to have those uncomfortable conversations. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just my, again, interpretation, how I heard it.
Maybe I've misrepresented it. The uncomfortable conversations in Australia, I do have a sense that we are not as open as we were 20 years ago. But having said that, the conversation does continue and things do happen. We've just a few days ago, just last week, had an Indigenous convention where we're still grappling, our First Nations people are still grappling with the idea of treaty and representation in our constitution and things like that. So those very big conversations still do go on. And they're incredibly difficult and fraught and all those sorts of things. But despite the difficulty and lack of openness, the conversations are still going on and things do happen. I mean, I have to say, in terms of Asian Australian performance, it's the best time ever. It's a golden moment. So there's a disparity there.
And in response, in a way, the question becomes, how do we individually engage in asking for those uncomfortable conversations and bringing them in? And it has to be about doing it one at a time. It's, you can't wave a magic wand and just say it's all going to be different. another question?
This is a question for Karl, just in response to something you said around beating out the things that are problematic or challenging for millennial or young people who are leaders. So, would you be able to maybe shed some light on what is problematic and needs to be beat out of these young people? Or is that your unconscious bias, your hereditary prejudice in relation to ageism? Because I find as a young person in this space that I'm constantly the butt of everybody's joke.
I'd classify myself in the younger of the panel, for starters. But no, I know what you're talking about. Look, what's happened is this particular, I will explain a little bit more, this particular youth has had extreme opportunities because of the support of his family. And at 14, he went to Stanford University. And then he went on to do a master's at Stanford. He's incredibly clever, incredibly intelligent, but because of his focus on academia, he hasn't been able to necessarily gain some of the simpler experiences in a vocational sense. Now, whether that's about age, it's probably more about experience. But what I've found with him is that there's a resistance to really embrace and challenge, or to dig down and find some of those core things that can only be gained through experience. So, for example, in projects, God, I hope he's not on listening to this, but in projects, with him, I'm trying to find not those things where he achieves or where I know he can get the outcomes, but those things that he thinks are of a gone era. So those things like, he's very comfortable if it's on the social media. He'll populate social media in profound ways, but sometimes some of the disciplines require, say, a paper at a board level. I find those are the areas where those are not his technologies anymore. Those are not mediums that are necessarily familiar to him. So the challenge is the system the issue in being able to cater and manage his to his strengths, so what's the issue? Is it the system or is it him? And it's what I'm trying to work with him on, is the fact that I believe it's both of those things, and trying to work through and change systems to facilitate his skills, while at the same time trying to instill the discipline in him to talk and use other mediums as well.
So when you're saying beating the qualities or the difficulties out of the millennial, you also are insinuating beating the difficulties and problems out of the systems that we've created or inherited from a generation gone past.
Absolutely. I think the system needs to catch up to the likes of him, but I also think that he needs to meet the system halfway, and then I think that's where I think we can gain some advantages from the likes of this incredibly talented guy.
Certainly one of the pieces of unconscious bias I bring to a conversation around diversity is trying to limit it, trying to narrow it. And actually, diversity needs to be embracing at the broadest edges. And so we don't have enough young people sitting around the tables in governance environments. We are not allowing young people to take enough risks around the sorts of things that they need to do to learn. Nor do we have enough people with disabilities. We don't have enough women. We don't have, so actually this kind of conversation is about saying, let's think about this in its broadest possible terms, and let's have those uncomfortable conversations rather than just unconsciously and unfortunately just simply shoehorning everybody into a system as it is. Belinda.
I want to address the issue of the millennials as well, because I'm a Gen X creative and I love working with millennials, and I feel that I learn as much from them and that I need to learn as much from them as they learn from me. So I think in terms of working together, it's a partnership, and I get great joy out of those partnerships. And I think the more that I work with them, the more that I realise I really do need to plug in to the millennial mindset, because it's so different from mine. It's such a different context. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Karl, I think anybody who's been to Stanford University could probably write a report for the board, standing on their heads. And finally, I've written a book about bias, which is on the table at the front. And if you're interested in unconscious bias, come to my session, and also grab a book from the table.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Again, can I thank you all very much for engaging? It's absolutely part of an incredibly important part of the process. In summary, I would say there's a very big and important opportunity for us all as leaders to actually begin to ask the questions around how we manage, how we identify the value in diversity. So it's not actually about saying, how do we tick a box? How do we design a policy? How do we build a program? It's actually about saying, I absolutely know that we will be the richer for embracing diversity. As a leader, I recognise a responsibility that I have that says I may not actually be able to influence sufficiently who sits on the council, but I can invite to the council, we can invite to the council a range of voices that inform. Because I may not hold all of the cards at this particular moment, but I hold some of them. And at the very least, I need to begin asking the questions. And I need to be, as a leader, in a position to embrace the squirm. Never thought I'd use those two words in the same sentence. Embrace this. That could be my sentence of the day, embrace the squirm. And each of us has a responsibility, because each of us has, at one level or another, an opportunity to influence. And our capacity to use that influence will advance the conversation, again, not because it ticks a box, not because it's about a policy, but because we will have value from it, both in terms of audience development, in terms of idea generation, in terms of voices being heard. I thought one of the overarching things that came out of Abid's conversation with us was about making leadership opportunities. Because although, for me, the jury is out between nurture and nature, and I do think it's a bit of both, the reality is that nurtured or natured, without the opportunity, nothing happens. I also think that it's very useful to be reminded to get on and do stuff. That out of engagement will come engagement. So I would urge us all to be thinking about that as we actively pursue our own practice, our own leadership roles, our own opportunities. I would really like to thank the three of you. You brought a great deal to the conversation. You are all engaging and engaged. You are all significant leaders in your own rights, and we are the luckier to have you on the stage today, but to have you in our society. So thank you very much. I'm going to preempt Belinda because she's about to tell you it's afternoon tea, but I wanted to tell you it was afternoon tea. It is afternoon tea. And thank you once again for your involvement, and enjoy afternoon tea. Thank you.